It had been a long day, a long week, really. Michael Jordan sat in the back of his sleek black SUV, staring out the window as the landscape blurred by. The private jet had just touched down in Wilmington, North Carolina, but he couldn't feel the familiar rush of homecoming he once did. Now, at 61, everything felt like a distant echo. Success, fame, fortune, it all seemed so far away when faced with the loneliness of the man he had become. The streets of his hometown were unchanged. Old brick buildings, familiar storefronts, the kind of comforting sameness that could make a person believe time stood still. But in truth, nothing had stayed the same. His life, once a testament to hard work and determination, was now a labyrinth of meetings and decisions. Despite his wealth, despite the championships, there was a gnawing emptiness that couldn't be filled with accolades. He hadn't realized how tired he truly was until the hunger hit him, a deep, bone-weary hunger that seemed to mirror his soul's exhaustion. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that it had been hours since breakfast. He turned into the parking lot of a McDonald's. It wasn't his usual go-to, not even close, but there was something about being back in Wilmington that made him crave those simple flavors, those tastes that had once grounded him in the messy beauty of youth. It was a comfort, like a forgotten piece of the puzzle that, for a brief moment, promised to return him to a simpler time. Baseball cap, he muttered under his breath, reaching for it in the glove compartment. Even after all these years, even after everything he had achieved, he still couldn't escape the public eye. He stepped out, pulling the cap low over his brow. The golden arches loomed ahead, familiar and warm like a childhood memory. Inside, the atmosphere was full of everyday people, teenagers chatting, parents trying to keep their kids in check, workers clocking in for the night shift. Michael kept his head down, slipping into line, just another man waiting for his meal. A flood of memories. As Michael took his seat, he barely noticed the food in front of him. His mind was elsewhere, 1,000 miles away from the present moment, lost in a flood of memories that he hadn't expected to resurface. The scent of the fries, the sound of the soft drink pouring into a cup, they all seemed insignificant compared to the rush of emotion now flooding his senses. There he was, Leroy Wilson, standing at the grill, flipping burgers like he had done 1,000 times before, each movement a testament to a life lived with quiet dignity. Michael sat frozen, his eyes locked on his old friend, watching him from across the room. Leroy, the boy who had shown him the meaning of heart, the one who had taught him more about perseverance than anyone else. When Michael had been uncertain, when he had doubted his own worth, Leroy had believed. He had always believed. It wasn't just about basketball for Leroy. It was about showing up every day, doing the best you could with what you had, and always giving your all, even if no one else was watching. Memories of their shared past rushed to Michael like a tide. He remembered how Leroy had patiently taught him how to handle the basketball, dribbling between his legs when Michael's hands were too small and his body too awkward to control the ball. He recalled the way Leroy had believed in him before anyone else did, long before Michael could even imagine the fame that would one day be his. Leroy had told him, "You've got heart, Mike. Talent can only take you so far. It's your heart that will make you great." And Michael had carried that lesson with him every day. It had been that unshakable belief in his own heart that had driven him to push through every hardship, to work harder than anyone else, to defy every doubt. It had driven him to be the Michael Jordan the world knew today, champion, icon, and billionaire. But looking at Leroy now, something deep inside Michael shifted. He realized in that quiet moment of reflection that his success, everything he had achieved, had not come without a price. The mansion, the endless accolades, the fame, it had all come at the cost of the simple, authentic connections that he had once cherished. And in that very same moment, watching Leroy work, Michael understood that perhaps those things were worth more than all the championships combined. Leroy had once been the person who believed in him when no one else did. He had given him a sense of purpose long before Michael had known he needed it. But now, Michael wondered, had Leroy gotten the same chances? Or had life dealt him a different hand, one filled with fewer opportunities, fewer breaks, while Michael's life had been paved with gold? There was no judgment in Michael's heart as he watched his old friend, But there was a sadness, a realization that Leroy had never received the same kind of opportunities that he had been given. And yet, here he was, working at a McDonald's, still carrying himself with a kind of dignity that Michael could never forget. For a brief moment, Michael wondered if he had truly earned all the things he had. Did he deserve the fame, the fortune, the life that so many only dreamed of? Or had he simply been lucky, just a kid who had been in the right place at the right time? But as he sat there, unable to tear his eyes away from Leroy, Michael realized something else. Leroy had something Michael would never forget, something that had never left him, even in the face of all the wealth and success. Leroy had heart, the very same heart that had helped Michael rise to the top, the same heart that had told him to never give up when the world said he should. And now, sitting there in a McDonald's booth, Michael found himself missing that heart. Missing Leroy's belief in him. Missing the simplicity of their friendship, the honesty in their shared moments. As the years passed, the world had given Michael everything it had to offer, but at that moment, as he watched Leroy wipe the sweat from his brow, Michael realized he had lost something far more important in the pursuit of it all. A true connection to the past, to the people who had shaped him, who had seen him for who he truly was, long before the world knew his name. And it was then that Michael made a decision that would change both their lives forever, because in the face of all his fame and fortune, nothing mattered more than that old promise, that old bond. It was time to fulfill it. Reflecting on their different paths. As Michael watched Leroy work, his gaze never left him. With every flip of the burger, every quick glance he gave the grill, Leroy seemed more like the person Michael had once known. The same determination, the same pride in his work. But now, in the quiet of the McDonald's, surrounded by the hum of the fryer and the chatter of customers, Michael couldn't ignore the overwhelming questions swirling in his mind. What happened to Leroy? Where did life take him after their paths diverged? Why was he here, flipping burgers in his hometown, when Michael had flown in from one of the wealthiest cities in the world, a global icon whose name was synonymous with greatness? It was an uncomfortable realization. Michael had spent his life chasing victory, on the court, in business, and in life itself. But now, as he sat there watching Leroy, he was struck by the fact that not all victories were measured by championships, wealth, or fame. Leroy had always been the one to emphasize what truly mattered. Heart. It wasn't the accolades, the titles, or the recognition that defined someone's worth. It was the heart, the integrity, the ability to stand tall no matter the circumstances. And yet, here Leroy was, working at a McDonald's, far removed from the basketball courts they had once dreamed of conquering together. It wasn't just the job that caught Michael off guard. It was the realization that while he had been given opportunities, Leroy had somehow missed out on his own. Michael couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had always been told that greatness was achieved by those who worked hardest, by those who seized every opportunity that came their way. But now, sitting in this familiar booth, with memories of those long summer days spent shooting hoops with Leroy, Michael began to question the truth of that belief. What had happened to Leroy after they lost touch? Had the world not seen his potential? Had he not been given the same chances Michael had? Or had something else happened along the way, something beyond his control? Leroy had been a star in their neighborhood, a natural athlete who could outplay anyone on the court, even Michael at times. Everyone had said Leroy would make it big, that he was the one destined for the NBA. They had made a pact, two young boys with wild dreams, to make it to the top, together. But only one of them had kept that promise. Michael's success was a result of years of tireless work, but it was also a result of fortunate timing, of doors opening that Leroy never seemed to have the opportunity to walk through. And as Michael watched Leroy moving with a quiet dignity, helping a young worker clean up a mess, his mind wandered back to the times when Leroy had been his biggest cheerleader. He remembered the many hours spent on that cracked concrete court, with Leroy teaching him how to move, how to protect the ball, how to outsmart his opponents with speed and precision. Those lessons had stayed with Michael, not just in basketball, but in life. Leroy had always said, "Talent only gets you so far, Mike. It's the work you put in when no one's watching that makes you great. And Michael had taken that to heart, literally. He had spent endless hours practicing, perfecting his shots, working harder than anyone else. He had made his own luck, found his own opportunities. But Leroy's words rang louder in that moment than any victory ever had. Had Leroy had the same opportunities? Had he worked just as hard, only to be passed over? Or had life dealt him a different hand, one full of setbacks and struggles that Michael could never understand? As Michael sat there, watching his old friend work, he realized that greatness wasn't always determined by the number of trophies or the size of a paycheck. It was about character, about resilience. It was about how you carried yourself, even when the world didn't give you the chance to shine. Leroy had always been the one to remind Michael of what truly mattered. While Michael had been swept up in the whirlwind of fame and fortune, Leroy had quietly lived his life, working hard, staying humble, and doing the best he could with what he had. And that was something that no championship or endorsement deal could replace. Michael's heart sank as he thought about how much he had taken for granted. The chances that had come his way, the moments of fortune that had shaped his career. He realized now how easy it was to lose sight of the people who had been there when you had nothing, when you were just starting out. Leroy had never asked for anything in return, but Michael knew he owed him more than words could ever express. And in that moment, Michael made a vow to himself. It wasn't enough to sit idly by, watching from a distance, feeling guilty for a life that had unfolded differently for both of them. Michael knew he needed to do something that would show Leroy just how much he meant to him and how much his friendship had truly shaped Michael's journey. The world had given Michael everything, fame, wealth, and recognition, but it was Leroy who had given him something far more valuable, the belief that greatness came from within. And now it was time to repay that kindness. The moment Michael realized. The evening stretched on as Michael sat in the booth, his food now cold and untouched. The rhythmic hum of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background as his mind swirled with the memories of days gone by. Leroy's face, lined with age but still holding that familiar steadfast expression, was burned into his thoughts. It wasn't just a chance encounter. It was fate, Michael realized. This was the moment he had been waiting for without even knowing it. Michael had spent so much of his life pursuing success, chasing victory after victory, never once pausing long enough to truly appreciate the deeper connections that had shaped him along the way. Success had been his driving force, his escape from uncertainty, from pain, from feeling unworthy. But now, sitting here, watching Leroy move about the kitchen with quiet confidence, Michael understood the weight of what had been missing all these years. It wasn't just about the awards, the rings, the glory. It was about the people who had believed in him before the world ever did. It was about the ones who had seen his potential, when all he had was heart. And Leroy had always been there, hadn't he? Long before the fame, long before the contracts and the adoration, Leroy had been the one who stood by him. He had been the one to teach him the most important lessons. Lessons that had stayed with Michael throughout his career, even in the moments when it seemed like everything else was falling apart. "You've got heart, Mike," Leroy had said, his voice strong and steady even when others doubted. Those words had echoed in Michael's mind in every dark moment of his career. When the losses piled up, when the critics came out in full force, it had been Leroy's belief in him that had fueled Michael's fire. But now, after all these years, Michael realized that Leroy had never had the same kind of belief in himself. Where had life taken him? Had the world forgotten the quiet, humble hero who had been just as gifted as any other? What had robbed Leroy of the opportunities he so richly deserved? Was it a series of misfortunes? Was it just the way life worked, rewarding some while leaving others behind? Michael's chest tightened. A feeling of helplessness washed over him. There was no answer to those questions, at least not an easy one. But there was one thing he knew for certain. It wasn't enough to just sit there and feel guilty. It wasn't enough to just watch Leroy work from afar, lost in his own reflection. Michael owed it to his friend, to the boy who had believed in him before anyone else did, to make things right. For years, Michael had surrounded himself with coaches, agents, and teammates, people who had helped him achieve the highest accolades. but in that moment he understood that success without meaningful relationships was hollow. No number of championships or endorsement deals could replace the value of the friendship they had once shared. No victory could fill the space left by the absence of those who had made him who he was. Michael stood up, his mind made up. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't go back to the hotel, bury his feelings under another layer of fame, and forget about Leroy. This wasn't just about a reunion. This was about redemption. Michael had a promise to keep. A promise made on the cracked concrete courts of Wilmington. A promise made when their dreams were still raw and unrefined. The promise that they would both make it to the NBA. The promise that no matter where life took them, they would always have each other's backs. Tomorrow, Michael decided, he would come back. He would talk to Leroy. He would step into that McDonald's and do something he had never done before. Reconnect. Not just for himself, but for Leroy too. It wasn't about apologies or regret. It was about honoring the friendship they had, and making sure Leroy knew that he had never been forgotten. As he walked to the door of the McDonald's, Michael's mind was clear. He had spent so much time focusing on winning the big games, on proving his worth to the world, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would put aside the fame and the fortune and simply be Michael Jordan, the man who had a best friend named Leroy Wilson. And in that quiet resolution, Michael finally understood. The most meaningful victories in life aren't the ones you achieve alone. They're the ones that come from lifting others up, from showing up for the people who have stood by you, even when you didn't deserve it. And Leroy had always been there for him. It was time to be there for Leroy. The decision. Michael's heart beat a little faster as the night crept into the early hours. He couldn't shake the weight of the decision he had made earlier. Tomorrow he would return to McDonald's. Tomorrow he would talk to Leroy. But the anticipation of what that conversation might bring left him in a restless haze, tossing and turning in his hotel bed, unable to sleep. The thoughts of his childhood friend, the boy who had helped him believe in himself when he didn't even know what belief felt like, circled in his mind like a whirlwind. It was strange, this feeling of uncertainty. Michael Jordan, the six-time NBA champion, the billionaire businessman, the global icon. He had faced pressure, expectations, and the weight of the world. Yet this felt different. This was no game, no high-stakes match that could be won with just a perfect shot. No, this was about something deeper, something more personal. It was about confronting the past, facing the consequences of time lost, and reconciling with a piece of himself that had been left behind long ago. He remembered when he was just a kid, an awkward, skinny boy trying to fit in. He remembered the summer of 1973 when he first met Leroy. It had been a simple encounter on the basketball court, two boys with big dreams, neither of them knowing just how much that friendship would shape their futures. Leroy had been older, confident, a natural athlete with an unshakable belief in his abilities. He had been the first to show Michael that talent wasn't enough without heart. "You got to have heart, Mike," Leroy had told him. "Heart is what makes you great." Michael had listened, practiced, and worked tirelessly, but it was Leroy who had given him the foundation for all of it. He had been there, not just teaching him how to dribble or shoot, but teaching him how to see the game differently, how to understand that heart was the most important thing, that it was the thing that would carry him through the hard times. When Michael had failed to make the high school varsity team, it was Leroy who reminded him that setbacks were just part of the journey. "Don't worry about it, Mike," Leroy had said. "Keep working. The game will find you when it's ready." But the game hadn't just found Michael, it had embraced him. And Leroy, for reasons Michael would never fully understand, had disappeared without a trace, leaving Michael to carry on alone, his memories of their friendship slipping further into the past with every passing year. Michael had never understood why Leroy had left so abruptly. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just an empty space where his best friend used to be. He had been confused, heartbroken, feeling abandoned, even though he knew deep down that Leroy had never meant to hurt him. For years, Michael had buried that feeling. He had channeled his hurt into his game, into becoming the best, into proving to the world, and to himself, that he was worthy of every opportunity that came his way. But now, after seeing Leroy again, After being reminded of the quiet strength and unshakable belief that had once lived in that friendship, Michael realized something he had never truly understood. It wasn't the fame or the fortune that had made him who he was. It was the people who had seen him for who he truly was when he was just a boy with big dreams, a boy who had nothing but heart. Leroy had been that person. Michael sat up in bed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had made it this far, achieved everything he ever wanted. But what good was any of it without the people who had helped him get there? What good was success if you lost the things that mattered most? Tomorrow wasn't just another day in the life of Michael Jordan. It was a chance to make things right. It was a chance to honor the promise he had made to Leroy so many years ago, a promise to make it to the NBA together. And while only Michael had kept that promise, he now understood that it wasn't about the NBA. It wasn't about the championships or the trophies. It was about the heart they shared, the kind of heart that Leroy had taught him to trust when everything else seemed uncertain. As Michael lay back down and closed his eyes, he realized that he had never truly let go of Leroy. The pain of losing him all those years ago had stayed with him, but now he understood that it was not a pain to forget. It was a reminder of everything Leroy had given him, of the belief that had helped shape him into the man he had become. Leroy had never asked for anything in return, but Michael knew that it was time to show him that he had never forgotten. Tomorrow he would go back. Tomorrow he would reconnect with the boy who had shown him what it meant to truly have heart. Reconnecting with the past. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Michael woke up with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. He had spent the entire night thinking about Leroy, about their shared childhood, the dreams they once had, and the promise they made to each other. He had spent so many years chasing after things that didn't matter, letting the world's accolades fill the empty spaces inside him. But now, after seeing Leroy again, Michael realized that nothing he had achieved could ever replace the friendship they had shared, the bond that had been so strong, so full of promise, and yet had been broken without warning. His mind was made up. He wouldn't waste another day wondering. He wouldn't sit idly by, consumed by the guilt and confusion of the past. This was about more than just rekindling an old friendship. It was about honoring a piece of himself that had been lost to time. Leroy had been his first true friend, the one person who had always believed in him when he hadn't even believed in himself. Michael had a day full of meetings ahead, but none of that mattered anymore. His assistant had called, reminding him of the schedule he needed to follow. Michael had dismissed the reminder. Today, something far more important would take precedence, something that had been calling to him for years, but had only now become clear. He had decided to leave the world of celebrity, business deals, and awards behind. Today was for Leroy, for the boy who had taught him to never stop dreaming, no matter how hard life seemed. It was time to keep the promise, to show Leroy that he had never forgotten him, that he had never given up on their shared dream. Michael had spent his life chasing after success in ways that were often hollow, but this moment of reconnection was something he couldn't put off any longer. Walking through the familiar streets of Wilmington, Michael found himself flooded with memories of the days when things were simpler. The air smelled like summer, a mix of dust and grass, with the sound of basketballs bouncing in the distance. He could almost hear the laughter of him and Leroy, the sound of the ball hitting the pavement, the competitive banter as they pushed each other to be better. It wasn't the fame or the money that had shaped him. It was those moments, those simple, honest moments with Leroy, when they dreamed together and believed that no goal was too high. That was the bond they had, the one that had carried Michael through every hardship, even when he'd been alone. Leroy had been the one who gave him that belief, who gave him hope that he could overcome anything. When Michael arrived at the McDonald's, he found himself standing outside for a moment, looking at the building as though it held all the answers. The golden arches stood tall, a symbol of something that had become so much more than fast food. It was a place of memories, of first loves and friendships. But today it was the place where Michael would finally step back into a past he had long since buried. Leroy was inside, behind the counter, doing what he had done the night before. He didn't notice Michael at first, but when their eyes met, it was like time had folded in on itself. The years between them seemed to disappear in that instant. Leroy's expression softened, his eyes widened, and Michael saw it. the same recognition, the same familiarity in his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years seemed to hang in the air, unsaid words filling the silence. But then Leroy's face broke into a smile that Michael hadn't seen in decades. It was the same smile from their childhood, warm and genuine, as if no time had passed at all. Leroy's eyes were full of life, full of stories untold. "Mike," Leroy said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the years between them, "I never thought I'd see you again." Michael's throat tightened and the words came slowly, but they were the words he needed to say. "I never forgot you, Leroy," he said, his voice low but steady. "I should have done this a long time ago. I'm sorry it took me so long." Leroy paused for a moment, as though taking in the weight of Michael's words. Then he stepped forward, and the two of them shared an embrace, one that spoke volumes more than words ever could. In that brief moment, Michael felt the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had gained. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a healing, a coming together of two old friends who had been torn apart by the passage of time, but who still carried a bond that had never truly faded. "Mike," Leroy said again, this time his voice stronger, filled with the years of wisdom he had gained. "You kept your promise. You made it. I always knew you would." And in that moment, Michael understood. It wasn't about the NBA. It wasn't about the rings, the championships, or the fame. It was about the promise they had made, the belief they had shared, and the heart that had carried them both, even when life had taken them in different directions. Leroy had believed in him before anyone else did, and now Michael realized that the greatest gift he could give Leroy was to show him that he had never forgotten, that he had never let go of the bond they had built. As they parted, Michael knew that their friendship had come full circle. It wasn't the ending he had once imagined. It was better. It was a new beginning, a chance for them to share their stories, to reflect on the past, and to honor the connection that had always been there, waiting to be rekindled. Leroy had been his anchor, his foundation, and now Michael was finally able to give something back. "I'm proud of you, Leroy," Michael said, his voice full of emotion. "You were always the one who showed me what it meant to have heart. And that's why I'm here today, to remind you that I never forgot." As Michael left the McDonald's, the weight of the years seemed to lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, not because he had achieved everything he had ever wanted, but because he had finally come home to the one thing that truly mattered: friendship, heart, and the bond that had been there all along. The promise fulfilled. Michael stepped out of the McDonald's, the cool breeze of the early afternoon washing over him. It wasn't the familiar wind of championship celebrations or the adoring crowds that typically greeted him. No, this was different. This was a kind of quiet peace that settled into his chest, a feeling of something whole, something completed. The weight of years of unspoken words, of unanswered questions, seemed to have dissipated in the span of a few moments. And as Michael looked back toward the restaurant, he realized that the most important part of his journey hadn't been about the accolades or the trophies. It had been about the relationships he had built along the way, the people who had seen him for who he truly was, before the world did. For so long, Michael had been defined by what he achieved, the titles, the championships, the endorsement deals. But today, as he stood in the parking lot of a McDonald's, it hit him harder than ever that those things had never been the measure of his true worth. His worth was not in the number of rings on his fingers or the endless bank accounts. His worth was in the connections he had made, the people who had supported him when the world was still blind to his potential. The promise he had made to Leroy so many years ago had never truly been forgotten by Michael, even if he had never fully understood the depth of it until now. It wasn't just a promise to make it to the NBA. It was a promise to carry the belief Leroy had placed in him. An unwavering belief that, even when Michael doubted himself, Leroy had seen something extraordinary in him. It was a promise to remember that the road to success wasn't just about talent. It was about heart, and about the people who walked with you through the hardest of times. The silence that followed their conversation inside McDonald's wasn't awkward. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had shared, of the friendship that had once seemed so easy and full of potential. For a moment, Michael thought about all the times he had wished for a moment like this, the chance to reconnect with Leroy, to ask him what had happened, to understand where life had taken him. But the truth was, it didn't matter now. What mattered was that they had found each other again, even after all the years apart. Leroy had been the one to believe in him when the odds were stacked against him, when Michael couldn't even make his high school team. Leroy had been the first person to say, "You've got heart, Mike," when the world only saw an awkward, gangly kid with nothing but a dream. And that heart had carried Michael through everything. It had pushed him through the tough losses, the injuries, the criticisms. But in that moment of reunion, Michael realized it was not just his heart that had gotten him through. It was Leroy's belief in him that had shaped him into who he had become. As Michael made his way back to his SUV, he felt a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had spent so many years building his legacy, his name, his brand, his empire. But nothing compared to the legacy that had been quietly formed on a basketball court in Wilmington, with a ball in his hands and his best friend by his side. Leroy had been the first one to show him what it meant to have the heart of a champion, long before Michael even knew what it looked like. The road to success, Michael now understood, wasn't a straight line. It wasn't about climbing higher and higher on a ladder of fame and fortune. It was about remembering where you came from, honoring those who believed in you when no one else did, and staying true to the roots that made you who you are. Michael had learned that the true measure of success was not how far you climbed, but how well you brought others with you. And Leroy had been with him from the start, even when the world had yet to recognize Michael's potential. Driving away from the restaurant, Michael's mind was clear. He had made peace with his past and, in a way, with himself. He knew that he would never be able to go back and change the years that had passed, the moments lost in time. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the now, the chance he had to reconnect, to make things right, to honor the friendship that had shaped him and given him the courage to chase his dreams. As the road stretched out in front of him, Michael smiled to himself. He hadn't just fulfilled a childhood promise. He had found something even more important, a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be great. It wasn't about being the best on the court or the richest businessman in the room. It was about heart. It was about the people who stood by you, the ones who saw you not for what you had, but for who you truly were. And Leroy, in all his quiet dignity, had always seen that in Michael. As Michael drove away from that McDonald's parking lot with his heart full and his mind at peace, he realized that some moments in life are more than just reunions. They're chances to reconnect, to make things right, and to honor the past that shaped us. If Michael's journey touched your heart and reminded you of the importance of the people who believed in you before anyone else did, then take a moment to reflect. Maybe there's someone in your life who you've lost touch with. A friend, a mentor, someone who believed in you when no one else did. Don't wait another day. Reconnect, reach out, and honor those relationships. If you've ever felt the power of a promise or the weight of a friendship that has shaped your life, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this journey with Michael, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories of heart, triumph, and reconnection. Join the community, and let's continue to share the moments that truly matter.